The forgotten Omega lived in shame, unaware her kiss would break the Alpha King's curse. Chapter 1, Golden Eyes in the Rain. The alley reeked of garbage and broken dreams, but Seraphina pressed her back against the cold brick wall anyway, trying to disappear into shadows that weren't deep enough to hide her shame. Rain hammered the pavement like angry fists, soaking through her threadbare coat as Marcus cornered her with that familiar sneer twisting his handsome face. His designer shoes splashed through puddles that cost more than her rent, and she could smell the expensive cologne that used to make her feel safe but now made her stomach turn with memories of bruises hidden beneath makeup. "You think you can just walk away from me, Sarah?" Marcus's voice carried the same silky threat that had fooled everyone at the law firm where they'd met 2 years ago. Back then, she'd been a promising paralegal with dreams bigger than her small-town origins. Now she was nothing, fired for performance issues that coincidentally started when she tried to leave him, blacklisted from every decent job in the city, surviving on coffee shop wages that barely covered her studio apartment in the worst part of downtown. The golden band on his finger caught the streetlight, mocking her with the engagement that had become a prison before she'd found the courage to escape. "I gave you everything," he continued, stepping closer until she could see the dangerous glint in his dark eyes. "Made you somebody. And this is how you repay me? By disappearing like some pathetic little mouse?" His hand shot out to grab her wrist, fingers digging into skin that had healed from his grip too many times before. Seraphina flinched, hating herself for the automatic response, for the way her body still remembered to cower even though she'd sworn she'd never let anyone make her feel small again. The rain turned colder, or maybe that was just the ice spreading through her veins as she realized how alone they were in this forgotten corner of the city. She opened her mouth to scream, to fight, to do anything but stand there like the weak, broken thing he'd convinced her she was, but the words died in her throat as a shadow detached itself from the darkness behind Marcus. A man stepped into the pale yellow glow of the streetlight, tall and broad-shouldered, with black hair that gleamed wetly in the rain and eyes that seemed to catch fire in the dim light. There was something predatory in the way he moved, something that made the air itself feel charged with electricity, and when he spoke, his voice was low and rough like distant thunder. "The lady seems uncomfortable." The stranger's words were polite, but there was steel underneath them, and something else, something that made Marcus's grip on her wrist falter for just a moment. Seraphina found herself staring at the stranger's face, at the sharp cheekbones and the mouth that looked like it had been carved from stone, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of molten gold, burning with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe, and when they met hers for just a heartbeat, she felt something shift deep in her chest, like a door opening in a room she'd forgotten existed. "I suggest you let her go. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story." Marcus's laughter cut through the rain like broken glass, but Seraphina felt his grip on her wrist loosen slightly as he turned to face the stranger. "And who exactly are you to tell me what to do with my fiancé?" The lie rolled off his tongue easily. He'd always been good at twisting the truth until even she'd started to doubt her own memories of his cruelty. But something had changed in the air around them, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up and her heart race with a mixture of fear and inexplicable anticipation. The stranger stepped closer, and she caught a scent that was all rain and pine forests and something wild that made her think of moonlit nights and running free through endless darkness. "Ex-fiancé," Seraphina whispered, finding her voice for the first time in months. The words tasted like freedom on her tongue, bitter and sweet and terrifying all at once. Marcus's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing with the rage she knew too well, but before he could speak, the stranger moved. It was like watching lightning strike. One moment he was standing 3 feet away, the next he was between them, his hand wrapped around Marcus's wrist with what looked like casual ease but made her ex-boyfriend's face go white with pain. "She said ex-fiancé." The stranger's voice hadn't changed, still that same low rumble, but there was something underneath it now that made Seraphina's pulse skip and stutter. That means she's not yours to touch. His fingers tightened slightly, and Marcus actually whimpered. Marcus, who'd made her feel like nothing for 2 years, who'd convinced her she was too weak and stupid and worthless to survive without him. The stranger's golden eyes never left Marcus's face, but Seraphina could see the way his jaw clenched, the way the muscles in his neck went taut like a predator preparing to strike. Marcus tried to pull away, his free hand reaching into his jacket for something that made Seraphina's blood turn to ice. But the stranger was already moving, twisting Marcus's arm behind his back in one fluid motion that sent whatever he'd been reaching for skittering across the wet pavement. "I think you should leave," the stranger said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made the words sound less like a suggestion and more like a promise of violence barely held in check. "And I think you should stay away from her." For a moment, Marcus looked like he might argue, might try to reassert the control that had defined their relationship for so long. But then his gaze flicked to the stranger's face, and whatever he saw there made him stumble backward, clutching his wrist to his chest. "This isn't over, Sarah," he spat, but his voice shook with something that might have been fear. "You can't hide from me forever." He turned and fled into the rain, his expensive shoes slipping on the wet pavement, and Seraphina watched him go with a mixture of relief and terror because she knew he was right. He would never let her go that easily. The silence that followed Marcus's retreat was broken only by the steady drumming of rain on pavement and the sound of Seraphina's ragged breathing. She pressed herself back against the brick wall, suddenly aware that she was alone in a dark alley with a complete stranger who just made her tormentor flee like a scared child. The logical part of her brain screamed that she should run, that men who moved like predators and had eyes like molten gold were probably more dangerous than the devil she knew. But her body refused to obey, rooted in place by a fascination she couldn't name and a gratitude that made her throat tight with unshed tears. "Are you hurt?" The stranger turned toward her, and up close she could see that his face was even more striking than she'd first thought, all sharp angles and masculine beauty that belonged on movie screens or magazine covers, not in grimy alleys saving broken girls from their past mistakes. There was a small scar running from his left temple to his cheekbone, and another across his knuckles that suggested violence was no stranger to him. But his voice was gentle when he spoke to her, careful in a way that made her think he understood what it meant to be afraid. "I'm fine," she lied, because admitting weakness to a stranger felt almost as dangerous as staying with Marcus had been. But her hands were shaking as she pushed wet hair away from her face, and she could feel the tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. "Thank you. I don't know what he would have done if you hadn't." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence because they both knew exactly what Marcus had been planning, what he'd done before when there was no one around to stop him. The stranger's jaw tightened, and for just a moment his eyes seemed to flash with an inner light that had nothing to do with the street lamp overhead. "What's your name?" he asked, and something in his tone made her answer without thinking, the words slipping out before she could stop herself. "Seraphina," she whispered, and watched something flicker across his face. Surprise, recognition, something that made her wonder if they'd met before in a dream she couldn't quite remember. "Seraphina." He repeated her name like he was tasting it, rolling it around in his mouth like fine wine. "I'm Cale." The name suited him somehow, sharp and strong and dangerous, and when he extended his hand toward her, she found herself reaching out to take it without conscious thought. The moment their skin touched, electricity shot up her arm and straight to her heart, making her gasp and jerk backward. But Cale held on, his fingers warm and solid around hers, and for the first time in months she felt something other than fear, she felt alive. Chapter 2, Secrets in the Rain. Cale's touch burned against her skin in the best possible way, like sunlight after months of living in darkness. Seraphina stared down at their joined hands, watching raindrops scatter across his knuckles, and tried to understand why her entire body felt like it was waking up from a long, dreamless sleep. There was something about him that made her feel safe and terrified at the same time, like standing at the edge of a cliff and wanting to jump just to see if she could fly. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, gentle but possessive, and she shivered despite the warmth spreading up her arm. But beneath the electric sensation of his touch, something else stirred, a strange sense of familiarity that made no logical sense, like her skin remembered his hands even though they'd never met before tonight. "You're soaked," Cale observed, his golden eyes taking in her threadbare coat and the way her dark hair clung to her shoulders. "There's a cafe around the corner. Let me buy you something warm." It wasn't really a question, more like a statement of fact, and normally Seraphina would have bristled at the assumption that she needed rescuing. But there was something in his voice that made the offer feel less like charity and more like protection. Like he was claiming responsibility for her well-being in a way that should have terrified her but instead made her feel precious for the first time in years. The words echoed strangely in her mind, like she'd heard them before in a dream she couldn't quite grasp, and when she looked into his golden eyes, she caught a flicker of something that looked almost like grief. She should have said no. Should have thanked him politely and disappeared into the maze of city streets before he could ask questions she didn't know how to answer. But her apartment was cold and empty, and the thought of spending another night alone with her fears and regrets felt unbearable. "I don't have much money," she admitted, hating the way the words made her sound like exactly what Marcus had always called her: pathetic, dependent, worthless. But Cale's expression didn't change, didn't show even a flicker of the judgment she'd learned to expect from everyone else. Instead, something flickered across his face that looked suspiciously like recognition, as if he'd heard those exact words from her lips before and was bracing himself for what came next. "I didn't ask if you had money," he said simply, and something in the way he looked at her made her feel like she was worth more than all the expensive gifts Marcus had used to control her. "I asked if you wanted something warm." His hand was still holding hers, and she could feel calluses on his palm that spoke of hard work, of a life lived with his hands instead of behind a desk pushing papers. There was strength in those fingers, but gentleness too, and when he started walking toward the street, she found herself following without question. But as they moved through the rain-slicked streets, fragments of images flashed through her mind: this same walk, this same hand in hers, this same feeling of safety mixed with inexplicable dread, as if some part of her was trying to warn her about something she couldn't remember. The cafe was one of those tiny, hole-in-the-wall places that stayed open all night for insomniacs and shift workers, warm and bright against the cold darkness outside. But the moment Seraphina stepped through the door, her breath caught in her throat. The layout was exactly as she'd somehow expected: red vinyl booths along the windows, a long counter with mismatched stools, the smell of coffee and cigarettes, and something indefinably sad. She'd never been here before, she was certain of that, but every detail felt burned into her memory like a photograph she'd studied for hours. The elderly waitress with the silver beehive hairdo looked up from behind the counter and smiled at them with the kind of weary kindness that came from working the graveyard shift for too many years, and Seraphina found herself expecting the woman to call out, "Honey," before she even opened her mouth. "Evening, honey," the waitress said, exactly as Seraphina had somehow known she would. "Y'all want your usual booth?" The question was directed at both of them, but Seraphina felt a chill run down her spine because she didn't have a usual booth anywhere, hadn't been a regular customer at any establishment since Marcus had isolated her from her normal haunts. She started to correct the misunderstanding, but Cale's hand tightened on hers in warning, and when she looked up at his face, she saw tension there that hadn't been present in the alley. His golden eyes were scanning the cafe with the intensity of a predator assessing threats, but there was something else in his expression, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of battles fought too many times. Cale chose a corner booth where they could see the door, and Seraphina noticed the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, alert and watchful like he was expecting trouble. But it was more than simple caution. There was a quality to his vigilance that suggested he'd learned through bitter experience exactly what kinds of dangers might come through that door. When the waitress brought their coffee without being asked, setting down 2 steaming mugs and a small pitcher of cream, Seraphina felt another jolt of recognition. The coffee was black and bitter, exactly how she preferred it but had never ordered here before. She reached for the cream pitcher automatically, then stopped with her hand halfway to the table, staring at the familiar blue ceramic as if it held the secrets of the universe. "I've been here before," she whispered, and the words felt like they were being torn from her throat against her will. "But that's impossible." I've never been to this part of the city before tonight. The memory was there at the edges of her consciousness, frustratingly vague but undeniably real, sitting in this exact booth, across from those same golden eyes, having this same conversation while rain drummed against the windows and her heart raced with a mixture of fear and longing she couldn't explain. But every time she tried to focus on the details, they slipped away like smoke, leaving only the emotional residue of déjà vu so strong it made her dizzy. Cale's hands clenched around his coffee mug so tightly she was surprised the ceramic didn't crack, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled in a way that made her think he was fighting some internal battle. "Tell me what you remember," he said, and there was something in his tone that made it sound less like a request and more like a desperate plea. "Even if it doesn't make sense. Even if it feels like a dream. Tell me everything." His golden eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but instead made her feel like she was the most important thing in his world, like he was memorizing every detail of her features for reasons she couldn't fathom. "I remember." Seraphina closed her eyes and tried to catch hold of the elusive memories that kept sliding away from her mental grasp. "I remember sitting here with you before. Not tonight, but before. And I remember feeling safe with you, but also terrified. Not of you," she added quickly when she saw his jaw clench. "Of something else. Something that was coming for me." The images were clearer now, coming faster, Cale's face illuminated by lightning, his eyes blazing with grief and fury as he reached for her across a growing chasm of darkness. The sound of her own scream echoing in her ears as something dragged her away from him, and his voice calling her name like a prayer and a curse combined. "You remember dying," Cale said quietly, and the words hit her like a physical blow because suddenly she did remember, not just once, but over and over again, each death unique in its horror but identical in its finality. Marcus's hands around her throat in a dozen different locations. Creatures with glowing eyes and razor teeth tearing at her flesh in moonlit forests. Her own body consuming itself from the inside out as power she couldn't control burned through her veins like acid. And through it all, Cale's face in her vision, watching helplessly as she slipped away from him again and again. "You remember me trying to save you and failing every single time." The cafe around them seemed to flicker like a film reel skipping frames, and for a moment Seraphina could see through the illusion to the truth underneath, endless repetitions of this same scene, this same conversation, these same desperate attempts to change an outcome that seemed carved in stone. "How many times?" she whispered, and when Cale's composure finally cracked, she saw the full weight of his anguish laid bare. His golden eyes were bright with unshed tears, and his hands shook as he reached across the table to touch her face with the reverence of someone handling the most fragile treasure in existence. 374, he said, and his voice broke on the number. 374 times I've watched you die in my arms. 374 times I've felt my heart break when the loop resets and you look at me like a stranger again. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness, and she could feel the love in that touch, a love so deep and desperate and hard one that it made her chest ache with sympathetic pain. "I've tried everything, Seraphina. Different words, different choices, different strategies. I've tried keeping you away from Marcus, tried confronting him before he can hurt you, tried revealing the supernatural world to you gradually instead of all at once. Nothing works. Something always goes wrong." The memories were flooding back now in a torrent that threatened to drown her, hundreds of lifetimes compressed into moments, each one a variation on the same tragic theme. She remembered loving him with a desperation that transcended reason, remembered the way his kiss could make her forget every moment of pain Marcus had ever inflicted. She remembered discovering powers she'd never dreamed of and feeling them tear her apart when she couldn't control them. She remembered Marcus's face twisted with supernatural rage as he revealed abilities that went far beyond simple human cruelty. And she remembered dying, so many different deaths, but always with Cale's name on her lips and his love burning in her heart like the last ember of a dying fire. "Why doesn't the loop affect me the same way?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Why do you remember everything while I start fresh each time?" The knowledge was there in the recovered memories, fragmented but growing clearer, some cruel mercy built into the magical trap that held them, ensuring that while Kale was forced to carry the weight of every failure, every loss, every moment of helpless agony as he watched her die, she was spared that particular torture. It was a kindness that felt like the cruelest punishment of all, because it meant she couldn't learn from their mistakes, couldn't grow stronger or wiser or more prepared for the challenges that awaited them. Because you're human, Kale said simply, and then caught himself with a bitter laugh. Or mostly human. The magic that created this prison recognizes you as the victim, not the prisoner. You get to start fresh each time, unburdened by the weight of all our failures. But He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, she could see centuries of pain reflected in their golden depths. I remember everything. Every conversation we've had, every kiss we've shared, every promise I've made and broken. I remember the first time you told me you loved me, and I remember the sound you made when Marcus's claws tore out your throat. The casual brutality of his words made her gasp, but even as horror flooded through her, she felt the strange comfort of finally understanding the source of the bone-deep weariness she'd sensed in him from the moment they met. He carried the weight of hundreds of lifetimes on his shoulders, the accumulated grief of watching the woman he loved die over and over again while being powerless to prevent it. No wonder he'd looked at her in the alley like she was something precious beyond measure. To him, she was a miracle he'd been trying to preserve for what must have felt like an eternity. What's different about this time? She asked, because there had to be something different or he wouldn't have told her the truth. In all those other loops, he'd tried to protect her from the knowledge, tried to spare her the burden of understanding their situation. But tonight he'd chosen honesty, which meant he thought they finally had a chance to break free from the cycle that had trapped them both. What makes you think we can succeed now when we've failed so many times before? Kale's smile was small and fragile, but it carried the first hint of genuine hope she'd seen from him. Because you remembered on your own, he said, reaching across the table to take both her hands in his. Every other loop, I've had to tell you everything from the beginning, about the supernatural world, about us, about the curse that binds us both. But this time, you started remembering before I said anything. That's never happened before. Something is different about this iteration, something that's allowing you to retain pieces of your previous lives. The possibilities inherent in that revelation sent electricity racing through her veins, but it was tinged with terror because she understood the implications all too clearly. If she was remembering more, that meant she was becoming more connected to her supernatural nature with each loop. And if the memories of hundreds of deaths were accurate, her supernatural abilities were as likely to kill her as save her. The power that could break Kale's curse and free them both from this magical prison was the same power that had consumed her from within dozens of times before. Tell me about the curse, she said, because if they were going to break the cycle, she needed to understand exactly what they were fighting against. Not just yours, the one that's trapping us in this loop. Who cast it, and why? The coffee had grown cold between them, but neither of them moved to warm it. Outside the cafe windows, the rain continued to fall in the same steady rhythm it had maintained for hundreds of repetitions, and Seraphina found herself wondering if the storm itself was part of the trap, an endless cycle of precipitation that matched their endless cycle of hope and loss. His name is Aldrich, Kale said, and even speaking the name seemed to cause him physical pain. He was my brother, my twin, born minutes after me, but always convinced that those minutes had cost him his birthright. The golden eyes grew distant with memory, and Seraphina could see the weight of centuries pressing down on him like a physical burden. When the pack elders chose me as Alpha King instead of him, he swore he would make me suffer for stealing what he believed was rightfully his. The time loop isn't just a prison, it's a torture device designed to break my spirit by forcing me to watch you die over and over again. And Marcus? She asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. In the recovered memories, her ex-boyfriend had revealed abilities that went far beyond normal human capacity, supernatural strength, inhuman speed, claws that could tear through steel like tissue paper. But the exact nature of what he was remained frustratingly unclear, lost in the chaos and terror of memories that ended in violence and death. Marcus is Aldrich's creature, Kale said, and his voice carried a depth of loathing that made the air around them feel charged with electricity. A human that Aldrich corrupted and enhanced, given just enough power to be a credible threat but not enough to be truly independent. He's the weapon Aldrich uses to kill you in most of the loops, and he enjoys the work far too much. His hands tightened on hers, and she could feel claws extending briefly from his fingertips before he forced them to retract. In some loops, Marcus doesn't even remember being supernatural. Aldrich wipes his memory and lets him think he's just a controlling, abusive human. Those are almost worse, because the cruelty is purely his own. The revelation that her tormentor was essentially a puppet in someone else's game should have made her feel better, but instead it filled her with a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. She'd suffered for 2 years under Marcus's control, had her self-worth systematically destroyed by someone who was nothing more than a tool in a supernatural vendetta she'd known nothing about. The injustice of it burned in her chest like swallowed flame, and she found herself hoping that when this loop finally ended, when they finally found a way to break free, Marcus would learn exactly what it felt like to be powerless and afraid. How do we break it? The question came out harder than she'd intended, sharpened by anger and determination that felt new and strange. In the recovered memories, she'd been a victim in every loop, frightened, overwhelmed, dependent on Cale's protection even as her own uncontrolled power destroyed her from within. But something was different now, some fundamental shift in her nature that made her feel less like prey and more like a predator awakening to its own strength. What do we have to do to end this nightmare once and for all? Cale studied her face with those piercing golden eyes, and she could see him cataloging the changes in her expression, the way she held herself, the quality of determination in her voice. The curse can only be broken by an Omega's willing kiss given to their true mate while they're in full control of their power, he said slowly. But that's exactly what's killed you in so many loops. The power is too much for someone who doesn't know how to handle it. It burns through you like acid, consuming everything you are until there's nothing left but ash and regret. Then teach me, she said simply, and watched his eyes widen with a combination of hope and terror. You've had 374 chances to observe what goes wrong. You must have some idea of how to help me control the power instead of being consumed by it. It was a reasonable request, but she could see the fear in his expression, the bone-deep terror of someone who'd watched every plan fail, every hope crumble to dust in his hands. He was afraid to believe that this time could be different, afraid to invest too much hope in a possibility that had been denied to them so many times before. It's not that simple, he said, but there was something in his voice that suggested he'd been thinking along the same lines. The power isn't something that can be taught or controlled through technique. It's pure emotion made manifest, love and sacrifice and the willingness to give everything you are for someone else's salvation. But that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. The more you love me, the more power you generate. And the more power you generate, the more likely it is to destroy you. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Their love was both the key to their freedom and the instrument of her destruction. In loop after loop, the depth of her feelings for him had generated the power necessary to break his curse, but that same emotional intensity had made the power impossible to contain or control. It was like trying to hold lightning in her bare hands, beautiful and necessary and ultimately fatal. What if we approach it differently, she said, thinking out loud as the pieces of a plan began to form in her mind. Instead of trying to control the power after it manifests, what if we work on building my tolerance gradually? Small doses of supernatural energy, building up my capacity to handle it without being overwhelmed? It was a theory born more of desperation than expertise, but she could see something shift in Cale's expression, a flicker of possibility that hadn't been there before. That might actually work, he said slowly, and for the first time since he'd revealed the truth about their situation, genuine hope crept into his voice. We've never tried that approach before because there was never enough time. But if you're retaining memories from previous loops, if you're maintaining some connection to your supernatural nature between iterations. He trailed off, but she could see his mind racing through possibilities, strategies they'd never had the opportunity to explore. The cafe around them seemed to brighten somehow, as if their shared hope was enough to push back against the oppressive weight of the magical trap that held them. But even as optimism bloomed in her chest, Seraphina couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that somewhere in the shadows beyond the rain-streaked windows, predatory eyes were measuring their progress and finding it wanting. The game wasn't over yet, and she had the distinct impression that their mysterious enemy had contingencies in place for exactly this scenario. "How much time do we have?" she asked, because if her recovered memories were accurate, each loop lasted exactly 7 days from the moment she first encountered Kale in the alley. 7 days to fall in love, discover her supernatural nature, attempt to break his curse, and inevitably fail in some spectacular and painful fashion. It wasn't much time to master abilities that most supernatural beings spent decades learning to control. 6 days, Kale said, confirming her fears. The loop resets every Monday at midnight, exactly 1 week after Marcus first cornered you in that alley. That gives us 6 days to prepare you for what's coming, to build up your tolerance for supernatural power, and to figure out how to approach the curse breaking differently than we have before. His expression was grim but determined, and she could see the warrior he must have been before Aldrich's curse had trapped him in this endless cycle of loss and repetition. 6 days. It felt like nothing and everything at the same time, a handful of hours to accomplish what they'd failed to achieve in hundreds of previous attempts, but also a lifetime of possibility if they could just find the right approach. Seraphina felt her own supernatural nature stirring in response to the challenge, power flowing through her veins like warm honey, and for the first time in any of her remembered lives, it didn't feel like it was going to destroy her. Outside the cafe, lightning split the sky in a pattern she'd seen countless times before, but this time she found herself wondering if the storm was beginning to change as well. Because if they could break free from this magical prison, if they could finally defeat the curse that had bound them both for so long, perhaps even the weather would be free to follow its natural course instead of endlessly repeating the same tempestuous script. The game was far from over, but for the first time in 374 loops, they had something they'd never possessed before, hope backed by knowledge, love tempered by experience, and the growing certainty that this time, finally, impossibly, miraculously, this time might be different. Chapter 3, The Alpha's Hunger. Steam rose from Seraphina's coffee cup like ghostly fingers, and she wrapped her hands around the warmth while trying to find words for the nightmare her life had become. Across from her, Kale waited with the patience of someone accustomed to hunting, still and focused and completely present in a way that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. The cafe's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the sharp line of his jaw and the way his golden eyes seemed to glow with their own inner fire. When she finally spoke, her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Marcus was everything I thought I wanted," she began, staring into the dark surface of her coffee rather than meeting those intense eyes. "Successful, charming, sophisticated. He swept me off my feet like something out of a fairy tale." The words tasted bitter now, tinged with the knowledge of how thoroughly she'd been fooled. "He moved me into his penthouse, bought me beautiful clothes, took me to expensive restaurants. Made me feel like a princess." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only the hollow echo of dreams turned to ash. Kale's hands tightened around his mug, and she caught a glimpse of something flickering in his eyes, something that looked almost like hunger, but not for food. When did it change? His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the edge underneath, sharp as a blade. She finally looked up to meet his gaze and felt that same electric shock she'd experienced in the alley, like touching a live wire that connected directly to her soul. The intensity of his attention should have made her uncomfortable, but instead it made her feel brave enough to speak truths she'd never told anyone. Slowly, she admitted, remembering the way Marcus had chipped away at her confidence piece by piece, so gradually she hadn't noticed until it was too late. "First it was just suggestions. Maybe I shouldn't wear that dress. Maybe I should quit my job since he made enough for both of us. Maybe I shouldn't see my friends so much since they didn't really understand our relationship." Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the coffee to her lips. Then it was demands. Rules. Punishments when I broke them. The last word came out broken, and she saw Kale's jaw clench so hard she was surprised his teeth didn't crack. "He hurt you." It wasn't a question, and the way Kale said it made something deep in her chest respond with a mix of gratitude and recognition. Like he understood what it meant to carry invisible scars, to wear a mask of normalcy over wounds that never quite healed. His hand moved across the table toward hers, slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted to, but she found herself meeting him halfway, letting their fingers intertwine. "You don't have to tell me the details," he said softly, and the gentleness in his voice made tears burn behind her eyes. "But I need you to know, he will never touch you again." The promise in Kale's words sent a shiver down Seraphina's spine that had nothing to do with her rain-soaked clothes. There was something absolute about the way he spoke, like he was making a vow to the universe itself rather than just offering comfort to a stranger in a coffee shop. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, and she found herself studying his face. In the harsh fluorescent light, the way his dark eyebrows drew together when he was thinking, the slight flare of his nostrils when anger flickered through his carefully controlled expression, the full curve of his mouth that looked like it had been designed for sin and salvation in equal measure. But as she watched him, something nagged at the edges of her consciousness, a feeling that she'd memorized these same features before, traced these same lines with trembling fingers in moments of tenderness she couldn't quite remember. "You don't even know me," she whispered, but the protest felt hollow even as she spoke it. Because somehow, impossibly, it felt like he did know her, better than Marcus ever had despite their 2 years together, better than her own family who'd stopped calling when she'd isolated herself to avoid their worried questions. Kale's golden eyes seemed to see straight through all her carefully constructed walls to the broken, frightened girl hiding underneath, and instead of turning away in disgust, he looked at her like she was something precious. The intensity of his gaze made her feel exposed in ways that went beyond the physical, as if he could read the secrets written in her soul like words on a page. "I know enough," he said simply, and his voice carried a weight that made her wonder what secrets he was hiding behind those burning eyes. "I know you're stronger than you think you are. I know you survived something that would have destroyed most people. And I know that you deserve so much more than what he gave you." His words hit her like physical blows, not painful but powerful, chipping away at the foundation of self-hatred Marcus had built inside her brick by brick. But there was something else in his tone, something that sounded almost like grief. As if he was mourning losses she couldn't remember, speaking to wounds that went deeper than the obvious scars Marcus had left on her psyche. Outside the cafe windows, the city sprawled in all directions like a glittering web, but Seraphina felt like she and Kale existed in their own private bubble where time moved differently and the normal rules didn't apply. She wanted to ask him who he was, what he did for work, why he'd been in that alley at exactly the right moment to save her. But the questions felt dangerous somehow, like speaking them aloud might break whatever spell had been woven between them in the space of an hour. More than that, they felt unnecessary, as if on some level deeper than conscious thought, she already knew the answers. The realization should have been comforting, but instead it filled her with a vague unease that she couldn't quite name. "I should go," she said finally, though every instinct in her body screamed against leaving the warmth and safety of his presence. "It's late, and you've done enough for me already." But when she tried to pull her hand away from his, Kale's fingers tightened, not painfully but with unmistakable possession. His eyes flashed with something that might have been panic, and for just a moment she could have sworn she saw them glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the cafe's harsh illumination. The desperate quality of his grip made her heart race, not with fear but with a strange recognition, as if her body remembered being held by these same hands in moments of desperation she couldn't consciously recall. "Don't," Kale said, and the single word carried so much raw emotion that it made her breath catch in her throat. "Please don't go. Not yet." His voice cracked slightly on the plea, and she could see him struggling with some internal battle that went far beyond simple attraction to a stranger he'd just met. There was history in his golden eyes, a weight of experience that didn't match the timeline of their brief acquaintance. "There are things you need to know, Seraphina. Things about yourself, about what you are, about the man who's been hunting you your entire life." The words hit her like ice water, sending shock waves through her system that made her skin prickle with sudden awareness. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but even as the question left her lips, images began flickering through her mind, fragments of memories that felt both foreign and familiar, like scenes from a movie she'd watched so long ago that only the emotional impact remained. A child running through moonlit forests with inhuman speed and grace. A teenager whose touch could heal wounded animals with nothing more than concentrated will. A young woman whose dreams were filled with golden eyes and promises of protection that always seemed to slip away just before she woke. "Marcus isn't what you think he is," Cale said, his voice low and urgent as he leaned across the small table between them. "He's not just an abusive boyfriend with control issues. He's a witch, Seraphina. A powerful one who's been systematically stealing your memories for years, keeping you weak and confused so you can't access your true nature." The revelation should have sounded insane, the ravings of someone who'd read too many fantasy novels or spent too much time alone. But something deep in her core recognized the truth of his words, responding with a resonance that made her entire body hum with suppressed energy. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her protest lacked conviction because the pieces were already falling into place with sickening clarity. The gaps in her childhood memories that she'd always attributed to trauma. The way certain places or objects triggered flashes of recognition she couldn't explain. The recurring dreams that felt more real than her waking life, filled with magic and moonlight and a sense of belonging she'd never found in the human world. People can't just steal memories. That's not how the world works. Cale's laugh was bitter and without humor, a sound that spoke of frustration built up over years of watching helplessly from the sidelines. "The world is far stranger and more dangerous than most humans realize," he said, and something in the way he emphasized the word humans made her wonder exactly what category he placed himself in. "Magic is real, Seraphina. It's all around us, hidden in plain sight by those with the power to manipulate perception and memory. And you're one of the most powerful supernatural beings I've ever encountered, when you're allowed to remember what you truly are." The statement hung between them like a challenge, daring her to accept or reject a reality that would change everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. Part of her wanted to laugh, to dismiss his words as the delusions of someone who'd clearly lost touch with reality. But a larger part, the part that had always felt like she was living someone else's life, wearing someone else's skin, recognized the truth in what he was saying. The constant sense of wrongness that had plagued her since childhood, the feeling that she was meant for something more than the mundane existence she'd been trapped in, suddenly made perfect sense. "What am I?" she asked, and the question came out in a whisper that barely disturbed the air between them. But even as she spoke, she could feel something stirring deep within her core, power that had been dormant for so long she'd forgotten it existed, responding to the first honest conversation about her nature she'd had in years. Her skin began to tingle with electricity that had nothing to do with Cale's touch, and she could smell things she'd never noticed before, the metallic tang of fear from other customers in the cafe, the wild scent of pine forests that seemed to emanate from Cale's skin, the acrid stench of old magic that clung to her clothes like smoke. "You're an Omega," Cale said, and his voice carried a reverence that made the words sound like a prayer. "The rarest and most powerful type of werewolf, born maybe once in a generation with abilities that go far beyond simple shape-shifting. You can heal with a touch, influence emotions with your presence, and generate enough raw power to level city blocks when you're properly motivated." His golden eyes never left her face as he spoke, cataloging her reactions with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting years for this moment. "But Marcus has been keeping you from accessing any of that power, stealing your memories every time you get close to awakening your true nature." The word werewolf should have been the breaking point, the moment when rational thought reasserted itself and she walked away from this conversation before it could drag her any deeper into delusion. But instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve her entire life. The dreams of running on 4 legs through endless forests. The way wild animals had always been drawn to her, approaching without fear when they should have fled from human contact. The inexplicable sense of kinship she felt with the moon, strongest during the full phase when sleep became impossible and her skin felt too tight for her bones. "How many times?" she asked, and somehow Cale understood exactly what she meant without further explanation. His face went pale, and she could see old pain flickering in his golden eyes, the kind of anguish that came from watching someone you cared about suffer over and over again while being powerless to help them. "How many times has he stolen my memories? How many times have we had this conversation before?" "I've lost count," Cale admitted, and his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "Dozens, maybe hundreds over the years. Every time you start to remember, every time you begin to access your power, he finds you and wipes your mind clean. Then he implants false memories of a relationship that never existed, makes you believe you chose to be with him when the truth is he's been holding you prisoner since you were barely 18. His hands clenched into fists on the table, and she caught a glimpse of claws extending from his fingertips before he forced them to retract. "I've been searching for you for 7 years, Seraphina. 7 years of finding you just long enough to watch him take you away again." The number hit her like a physical blow, because according to her memories, she'd only known Marcus for 2 years. But if Cale was telling the truth, if her entire relationship with Marcus was built on stolen memories and implanted lies, then years of her life had been erased so completely that she couldn't even sense the gaps where they should have been. The violation of it, the sheer scope of what had been taken from her, made her stomach churn with a mixture of rage and nausea that threatened to overwhelm her completely. "Show me," she said suddenly, the words coming from some deep well of determination she hadn't known she possessed. "If what you're saying is true, if I really am this Omega, then show me. Help me remember what he stole." It was a dangerous request. She could see that in the way Cale's expression shifted from hope to terror in the space of a heartbeat. But she was tired of being a victim, tired of living a life that felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. If there was even a chance that her true self was hidden somewhere beneath Marcus's manipulations, she had to take it. "It's not that simple," Cale said, but she could see the longing in his eyes, the desperate desire to give her back everything that had been taken. Recovering stolen memories isn't like watching home movies. It's traumatic, disorienting, and potentially dangerous. If Marcus has been suppressing your supernatural nature for years, awakening it suddenly could trigger a power surge that you're not equipped to handle. His voice carried the weight of experience, suggesting he'd seen the catastrophic results of supernatural abilities awakening too quickly or without proper guidance. "I don't care," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I'd rather die as myself than live as his puppet for one more day." The declaration surprised her with its vehemence, but she could feel the truth of it burning in her chest like swallowed fire. Whatever Marcus had done to her, however many years he'd stolen, she wanted them back. She wanted to know who she really was, what she was capable of, why Cale looked at her like she was worth fighting a war over. Cale studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing options she couldn't begin to imagine. Finally, he nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "There's a way," he said carefully. "But it requires trust, absolute, complete trust. I'll have to establish a mental connection between us, share some of my own memories to help guide yours back to the surface. It's intimate in ways that go beyond the physical, and once we start, there's no stopping until it's finished." The warning should have given her pause, should have made her reconsider the wisdom of allowing a stranger, no matter how compelling, access to the most private corners of her mind. But Seraphina found herself nodding without hesitation, driven by a bone-deep certainty that Cale was the key to unlocking everything Marcus had hidden from her. "Do it," she said simply, and watched something that might have been relief or gratitude or desperate love flicker across his features. Cale reached across the table and took both her hands in his skin warm and slightly rough against her palms. "Close your eyes," he said softly, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality that made her eyelids feel heavy. "Try to empty your mind of everything except the sound of my voice and the feeling of my hands holding yours." She obeyed without question, letting her consciousness drift in the comfortable darkness behind her closed lids while his thumbs traced soothing patterns across her knuckles. The change began slowly, so gradually that at first she thought she might be imagining it. A warm tingling sensation started where their skin touched and spread up her arms like gentle electricity, carrying with it a sense of connection that went deeper than physical contact. She could feel Cale's presence in her mind, not invasive or overwhelming, but comforting, like discovering a room in her house she'd forgotten existed. His mental voice was softer than his spoken words, colored with emotions too complex for simple language to convey. "Let me show you who you really are," he whispered directly into her thoughts, and suddenly the world exploded into memory and sensation that made her gasp with recognition. She was 7 years old again, standing in her grandmother's garden while the old woman taught her to coax flowers into bloom with nothing more than gentle touch and focused intention. The memory was crystal clear, unburdened by the fog that had clouded so many of her childhood recollections, and she could smell her grandmother's lavender perfume as if the woman were sitting right beside her. "Keep going," Cale encouraged, his mental presence steady and reassuring as more memories surfaced like bubbles rising from deep water. She was 12 and running through the forest behind her childhood home, her human form falling away like shed clothes as powerful muscles bunched and stretched beneath silver-gray fur. The sensation of perfect freedom, of being exactly what nature had intended her to be, was so overwhelming that tears began streaming down her face in the present moment. This was what Marcus had stolen from her, not just memories, but the very essence of who she was meant to be. The cascade of recovered memories accelerated, years of her life returning in a rush that made her feel dizzy with the scope of what had been hidden from her. Her first transformation at 13, guided by pack elders who'd recognized her Omega nature and treated her with the reverence usually reserved for sacred artifacts. The way other wolves had responded to her presence, drawn by instincts older than civilization, seeking the healing and comfort that only an Omega could provide. The gradual awakening of abilities that went far beyond simple shape-shifting, power that could mend broken bones with a touch and calm raging storms with focused will. But with the recovered memories came pain, because she could see now how systematically Marcus had dismantled her life. The first time he'd approached her, she'd been 19 and fully aware of her supernatural nature, living with a pack that treasured her as their most precious member. He'd seemed like nothing more than a charming human with an interest in folklore and mythology, asking innocent questions about local legends while his true intentions remained hidden behind layers of magical deception. He killed them, she realized with dawning horror, the memory surfacing like a knife to the heart. "My pack, my family, he killed them all when they tried to protect me." The massacre played out in perfect, terrible detail, Marcus revealing his true nature as his magic turned the pack's own strength against them, twisting their protective instincts into weapons of self-destruction. She'd watched helplessly as everyone she loved fell to his power, too young and inexperienced to fight back against someone who'd had centuries to perfect his craft. "I'm sorry," Cale's mental voice was thick with shared grief, and she realized he'd been there that night, had tried to save her pack and failed, forced to watch from the shadows as Marcus claimed his prize and began the long process of breaking her down. "I tried to stop him, but I was too late. By the time I arrived, he'd already begun the memory alterations. All I could do was follow and wait for opportunities to help you remember." The revelation that Cale had been watching over her for years should have felt invasive, but instead it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with supernatural power. Even when she'd forgotten him, even when Marcus's magic had convinced her she was nothing more than a damaged human with no family and no future, Cale had never stopped looking for ways to save her. The depth of his devotion was staggering, a love so pure and selfless that it made her previous relationship with Marcus look like the pale shadow it had always been. "Why now?" she asked silently, though part of her already knew the answer. "What's different about this time that makes you think we can finally break free from his control?" The question hung between them in the space where minds touched, loaded with the weight of years of failure and the desperate hope that this time might be different. "You're stronger now," Cale replied, and she could feel his certainty like warm sunlight on her skin. "Each time he erases your memories, he can't completely destroy the foundation of who you are. Your power has been growing in the spaces between his manipulations, building up like pressure behind a dam. I think you're finally strong enough to break through his conditioning completely." The memories were coming faster now, a torrent of experiences that Marcus had stolen flooding back with increasing intensity. She remembered meeting Cale for the first time at 17, the instant recognition that had flared between them like lightning striking earth. She remembered the gradual courtship that had followed, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of the supernatural world rather than the manipulation and control that had defined her relationship with Marcus. She remembered loving him with a completeness that had made her feel like she was finally whole, finally home in her own skin. But most importantly, she remembered power, not the destructive force that Marcus's magic represented, but the healing, nurturing energy that was her birthright as an Omega. She could feel it now, stirring to life in response to the recovered memories, filling her with strength and purpose she'd forgotten she possessed. Her skin began to glow with soft, silver light that had nothing to do with the cafe's harsh fluorescent bulbs, and she could sense other supernatural creatures throughout the city turning toward her like flowers following the sun. "He's coming." Cale's mental voice carried a note of urgency that made her open her eyes and return to the present moment. "Marcus can sense what we're doing. The memory recovery is creating too much magical energy to hide. We need to leave, now, before he can get here and undo everything we've accomplished." Seraphina nodded, not trusting her voice as she struggled to process the overwhelming flood of recovered memories while maintaining her grip on the present moment. She could feel Marcus's presence like a storm on the horizon, dark magic approaching with the inevitability of a natural disaster. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She knew who she was now, what she was capable of, and she had no intention of letting him steal her identity again. "Take me somewhere safe," she said aloud, her voice steadier than she'd expected given the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Somewhere he can't find us while I learn to use my power properly." The words felt strange on her tongue, confident in a way she hadn't been since childhood, but they also felt right, like finally speaking in her native language after years of struggling with foreign phrases. Cale's smile was radiant with relief and hope and something deeper that made her heart race with anticipation. "I know just the place," he said, standing and throwing money on the table for their untouched coffee. "My pack has been waiting 7 years to meet their true Omega. I think it's time we went home." As they prepared to leave the cafe, Seraphina caught sight of their reflection in the rain-streaked window and felt a shock of recognition. The woman looking back at her was the same person who'd entered the building hours earlier, but everything about her was different: the way she held herself, the confidence in her posture, the silver light that seemed to emanate from her skin like captured moonlight. She looked like someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of, someone who would never again allow herself to be diminished or controlled by another person's will. Marcus had stolen years from her, had murdered her family and erased her identity with magical precision that spoke of centuries of practice. But he'd made one crucial mistake: he'd underestimated the resilience of the very nature he'd tried so hard to suppress. She was an Omega, born to heal and protect and lead, and no amount of memory manipulation could completely destroy something that fundamental. The game had changed, and for the first time in 7 years, Seraphina was playing with a full deck of cards. Marcus was coming, drawn by the magical energy of her awakening like a moth to flame, but he would find a very different opponent than the broken, confused girl he'd been tormenting for so long. She had her memories back, her power awakening more fully with each passing moment, and an alpha at her side who'd proven his devotion through years of patient waiting. Let Marcus come. She was ready for him. Chapter 4: The Beast Within. Cale's grip on her hand was warm steel, unbreakable but gentle, and Seraphina felt her pulse skip as she watched something wild flicker behind his golden eyes. The cafe suddenly felt too small, too bright, filled with the electric tension that came before lightning strikes. She could smell him even across the small table, rain and pine and something darker that made her think of midnight forests and creatures that hunted by moonlight. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than before, like he was fighting some internal battle she couldn't see. "Let me drive you home," he said, and it sounded less like an offer and more like a barely controlled plea. "It's not safe for you to be alone on the streets. Not tonight." There was something in his tone that made her look around the cafe with new eyes, noticing how the other late-night customers seemed to be avoiding their corner booth, how the waitress kept glancing nervously in their direction before quickly looking away. The air itself felt charged with danger she couldn't name, and when Kale's thumb brushed across her knuckles again, she could have sworn she felt claws instead of fingertips. Marcus's words echoed in her mind, "You can't hide from me forever," and suddenly the warm safety of the cafe felt like an illusion that could shatter at any moment. "He knows where I live," she admitted, hating how small her voice sounded. "He has keys to my building, friends in the security company. I'm not safe anywhere." The confession felt like failure, like admitting that even her escape had been incomplete, that she was still trapped in Marcus's web whether she lived in his penthouse or her tiny studio apartment. Kale's free hand clenched into a fist on the table, and she caught a glimpse of something that definitely weren't normal fingernails extending from his knuckles before he quickly hid them from view. "Then don't go home," he said simply, and when she started to protest, he leaned forward with an intensity that stole her breath. "I have a place. Secure. Private. He'll never find you there." His golden eyes burned into hers, and she felt that same electric connection she'd experienced in the alley, like invisible threads binding them together at the deepest level. Every rational thought in her head screamed that going anywhere with a stranger was the height of stupidity, that she was trading one dangerous man for another potentially worse one. But there was something about Kale that bypassed her logical mind entirely, speaking directly to some primal part of her that recognized safety in his presence even when he looked like he could tear the world apart with his bare hands. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered, and his smile revealed teeth that seemed just a little too sharp in the cafe's fluorescent light. Kale's penthouse apartment occupied the entire top floor of a sleek glass tower that scraped the belly of the storm clouds, and Seraphina felt like she was stepping into another world as the private elevator carried them skyward in silence. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread below them like a circuit board, all glittering lights and dark spaces where danger might hide. The space itself was masculine and minimalist, all dark leather and steel and expensive artwork that spoke of wealth beyond anything she'd ever imagined. But it was the view that took her breath away, mile after mile of urban landscape stretching to the horizon like a kingdom laid out for a king. Something about the panoramic vista stirred memories she couldn't quite grasp, fragments of dreams where she'd looked down upon vast territories from impossible heights, feeling the weight of responsibility for every soul that lived and breathed within her domain. "Make yourself comfortable," Kale said, his voice echoing slightly in the open space. "There are clothes in the guest room if you want to get out of those wet things." He moved through the apartment with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in his domain, but Seraphina noticed the way his eyes constantly scanned the windows, the door, the shadows in the corners. Like he was always expecting an attack from somewhere, always ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it made her feel safer somehow, protected by someone who understood that the world was full of predators. There was something almost ceremonial about the way he moved through the space, as if he was performing rituals of protection that had been ingrained in him through years of practice. She found herself drawn to the windows, pressing her palm against the cool glass and staring down at the city where Marcus was somewhere hunting for her. From this height, her problems seemed smaller, more manageable, like she was finally above the reach of his grasping hands. But as she gazed out at the sprawling metropolis, something else stirred within her, a sense of ownership that had nothing to do with real estate or material possessions. The city felt like it belonged to her in some fundamental way, as if every street and building and living soul within its boundaries was part of something larger that she was meant to protect and guide. The feeling was so strong it made her dizzy, so alien to everything she'd been taught about herself that she pressed her forehead against the cool glass for support. "Who are you?" she asked without turning around, and she heard Kale's footsteps stop behind her. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, heavy with secrets and unspoken truths. But now that her supernatural memories were returning, she could sense layers of meaning in that silence, ancient protocols and forgotten ceremonies, bonds of loyalty that transcended simple human understanding. When Kale finally spoke, she could hear the weight of centuries in his voice, the burden of oaths sworn in moonlight and sealed with blood. "Someone who's been waiting a very long time for you," he said finally, and something in his tone made her turn to face him. He was standing in the center of the room with his hands clenched at his sides, and his golden eyes were blazing with an intensity that made her feel like she was staring into the heart of a fire. But there was something else in his expression now, a reverence that went beyond romantic attraction, something that looked almost like worship. "You're going to think I'm crazy," he continued, taking a step toward her, "but there are things about this world that most people never see. Things that go bump in the night and howl at the moon." As if summoned by his words, lightning flashed outside the windows, illuminating his face in stark relief and revealing something that made Seraphina's breath catch in her throat. For just a moment, his features seemed different, sharper, more predatory, with eyes that glowed like molten gold and canine teeth that were definitely longer than they should be. But beneath the obvious physical changes, there was something else, something that made her newly awakened supernatural senses sing with recognition. He carried himself like a warrior, but more than that, like a guardian sworn to protect something infinitely precious, even at the cost of his own life. "I'm not human, Seraphina," he said simply, and the words hung in the air between them like a challenge. "And neither, I think, are you." The transformation began slowly, his human form blurring at the edges as bones lengthened and reshaped themselves with sounds like breaking branches. His skin sprouted dark fur that gleamed like oil in the lightning-lit room, muscles bunching and flowing beneath his changing flesh as he took on a form that was both terrifying and magnificent. Within moments, where a man had stood, a massive wolf now crouched, beautiful and terrible and utterly wild, with golden eyes that held all the intelligence and intensity of the man he'd been. But even as awe and fear warred in her chest, Seraphina felt something deeper stirring to life, a recognition that went beyond the simple acknowledgement of supernatural nature. This wolf, this magnificent creature of moonlight and shadow, belonged to her in ways that transcended ownership or partnership. The knowledge flowed through her like warm honey, carrying with it the weight of ancient traditions and bloodline bonds that had been forged when the world was young. She took a step forward, her hand extended toward his massive head, and felt power singing in her veins, not the wild, uncontrolled energy she'd experienced before, but something regal and commanding that made the very air around her shimmer with silver light. "You're not just any wolf," she whispered, her voice carrying an authority she'd never possessed before. "You're mine. You've always been mine." The words felt right on her tongue, weighted with truth that resonated in her bones. As her fingers touched his fur, electricity shot through her entire body, but this time the sensation didn't threaten to tear her apart. Instead, it felt like coming home, like finding the missing piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve her entire life. The wolf, Kale, shuddered beneath her touch, a sound that was part relief and part desperate longing rumbling from his massive chest. The transformation back to human form was faster this time, less violent, and when Kale emerged from the golden light that surrounded them both, he immediately dropped to one knee before her. The gesture was so natural, so obviously correct, that Seraphina didn't even think to question it. Instead, she found herself placing her hand on his bent head in a motion that felt like the culmination of rituals performed for countless generations. "My lady," he said, and his voice carried a formality that spoke of ancient protocols and sacred duties. "My queen. I have waited so long for your return." "Queen?" The word escaped her lips in a breathless whisper, but even as she spoke it, images began flooding her mind, not the stolen memories that Marcus had taken, but older ones, deeper ones, embedded in her very DNA like genetic memory passed down through bloodlines that stretched back to the dawn of supernatural civilization. She saw herself as a child, not the broken, confused girl Marcus had created, but a young princess being taught the responsibilities that came with her birthright. She saw her parents. Not the vague figures Marcus had allowed her to remember, but powerful rulers whose very presence had commanded respect from every supernatural creature in their domain. "The Moonborn dynasty," Kale said softly, rising to his feet but keeping his eyes downcast in a gesture of respect that seemed as natural as breathing. "The original ruling family of all supernatural creatures, blessed by the moon goddess herself with the power to unite and command every species that walks between the worlds. Your bloodline has ruled for over 3,000 years, bringing peace and prosperity to creatures who had known nothing but chaos and war before your ancestors took the throne. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, rewriting everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. She wasn't just an Omega, she was royalty, born to a power and responsibility that made her previous human existence seem like a cruel joke. The knowledge should have been overwhelming, should have sent her to her knees with the weight of it, but instead she felt a sense of rightness settling over her like a comfortable cloak. This was who she was meant to be, what she'd been born for, the destiny that Marcus had tried so desperately to steal from her. "But my family," she said, struggling to reconcile the images in her mind with the reality she remembered. "They're dead. They died when I was young, in some kind of accident." But even as she spoke, she could feel the lie crumbling beneath the weight of returning memory. There had been no accident, no tragic coincidence that had left her orphaned and alone. There had been war, brutal, devastating conflict that had torn the supernatural world apart and left her bloodline scattered to the winds. "Not an accident," Cale said, and his voice carried a grief so profound it made her chest ache with sympathetic pain. "A coup. A carefully orchestrated rebellion led by those who believed the old ways were obsolete, that supernatural creatures should rule through fear and domination rather than unity and wisdom." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and she could see the struggle for control written across his features. "Your parents knew it was coming, they'd been preparing for months, making contingency plans to keep you safe even if they couldn't save themselves." The memories came flooding back then, no longer gentle trickles but a devastating torrent that made her gasp with the force of their return. She remembered the night her world had ended, the sounds of battle echoing through the ancient castle that had been her family's seat of power for centuries, the desperate attempts of her parents' guards to hold off an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. She remembered her mother's face, beautiful and terrible in her supernatural fury, as she'd pressed a pendant into Seraphina's small hands and whispered words of protection that would hide her true nature until she was strong enough to reclaim her birthright. "They sent me away," she whispered, touching her throat where she could almost feel the weight of a pendant that had been lost years ago. "My mother used the last of her power to hide me, to make me appear human so the rebels couldn't find me." The sacrifice implicit in that final act of maternal love was staggering. Her mother had literally given up her life to ensure her daughter's survival, channeling every ounce of her considerable power into a concealment spell that would last until Seraphina's 18th birthday. "The spell was supposed to break naturally when you came of age," Cale explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Your parents thought 18 years would be enough time for the political situation to stabilize, for loyal houses to reorganize and prepare for your return. But they couldn't have anticipated Marcus." His name fell from Cale's lips like a curse, loaded with centuries of frustrated rage and helpless fury. He was one of the rebels, a powerful witch who specialized in memory magic. When your concealment spell began to weaken, he was ready for you. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity, painting a picture of manipulation and control that went far beyond simple abuse. Marcus hadn't targeted her randomly, he'd been hunting her specifically, waiting for the moment when her royal bloodline would begin to manifest so he could trap her before she could access her full power. Every moment of their relationship had been calculated, every trauma designed to keep her weak and dependent while he systematically stripped away everything that made her who she was meant to be. "How long have you been looking for me?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The reverence in Cale's eyes, the weight of ancient loyalty that seemed to emanate from his very pores, these weren't the emotions of someone who'd recently pledged allegiance. They were the feelings of someone who'd been raised from birth to serve a specific purpose, trained from childhood to recognize and protect the bloodline he was bound to preserve. "All my life," Cale admitted, and there was something almost vulnerable in his voice despite the strength that radiated from his powerful frame. "My family has served yours for 15 generations. We're what's known as bloodline guardians, wolves born with the specific purpose of protecting the royal family. The bond between us isn't just emotional or romantic, Seraphina. It's mystical, woven into our very souls by magic older than recorded history." The explanation sent warmth flooding through her entire body, but it was accompanied by a terrible understanding of what that bond must have cost him. "The curse," she breathed, finally comprehending the true nature of his affliction. Being trapped between forms, it's not random punishment, is it? It's what happens when a guardian loses their charge. The knowledge felt like swallowing broken glass, because she understood now that his suffering had been her fault, the direct result of her family's death and her own disappearance from the supernatural world. When your parents died and you vanished, the guardian bond was severed but not broken, Kale explained, confirming her fears. I was left incomplete, unable to fully become either human or wolf because the magic that defines my very existence was searching for something that seemed to no longer exist. For 18 years, I wandered the world in agony, neither alive nor dead, sustained only by the faint hope that somehow, somewhere, you had survived. The magnitude of his sacrifice hit her like a landslide, threatening to drive her to her knees with the weight of guilt and gratitude combined. He'd suffered for nearly 2 decades because of her, endured a half-life of pain and incompleteness while she'd lived in ignorant bliss under Marcus's spell. The knowledge that his torment could have been ended at any time if she'd simply been strong enough to break free from her captor's control made her feel sick with self-recrimination. It's not your fault, Kale said quickly, stepping forward as if he could sense the direction of her thoughts. You were a child when this began, barely more than a baby when your parents died. No one could have expected you to overcome magic that powerful without help, especially not when you didn't even remember what you were fighting against. His hands reached for hers, and she let him take them, drawing comfort from the warmth and strength of his touch. What matters is that you're here now, that you're finally beginning to remember who you really are. And what happens now? She asked, because while the return of her memories was overwhelming, it was the implications for the future that truly terrified her. If I really am who you say I am, if I'm the last heir to some ancient supernatural dynasty, then there must be people out there who want me dead. The rebels who killed my family, they're not going to just let me walk back into power without a fight. Kale's expression grew grim, confirming her fears without the need for words. The supernatural world has been in chaos since your family's death, he admitted. Without a legitimate ruler to unite the different species, old rivalries have resurged and new conflicts have emerged. Some factions have tried to fill the power vacuum, but none have the bloodline authority necessary to command universal respect. Your return would change everything, but yes, there are those who would prefer to see you dead rather than restored to your rightful throne. The responsibility implicit in his words was staggering, but surprisingly, Seraphina found herself rising to meet it rather than being crushed beneath its weight. Perhaps it was the royal blood flowing through her veins, or maybe it was simply the relief of finally understanding her purpose in life, but she felt a strength building within her that had nothing to do with supernatural power and everything to do with acceptance of her destiny. She'd spent so many years feeling like she was living the wrong life, wearing the wrong skin, playing a role that had never quite fit. Now she understood why, because she hadn't been born to be ordinary. She'd been born to be a queen. Then we'll have to make sure I'm strong enough to face them, she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. You said the guardian bond was incomplete because you lost your charge. What happens if we restore it properly? What happens if I formally accept you as my protector? The question was loaded with implications that went far beyond the political, because she could feel the romantic potential simmering beneath their mystical connection. The bond between them wasn't just about duty and loyalty, it was about love, partnership, the kind of deep spiritual connection that transcended ordinary human understanding. Completion, Kale said simply, but the word carried layers of meaning that made her pulse race with anticipation. The restoration of my full power as your guardian and mate. The ability to protect you properly, to stand at your side as you reclaim your birthright and restore order to the supernatural world. His golden eyes blazed with an intensity that made her feel like she was staring into the heart of a star. But it requires a willing bond, freely given. I won't force you into accepting a connection you don't want, no matter how much I've suffered without it. The choice he was offering her was more significant than marriage, more binding than any human commitment she could imagine. To accept him as her guardian would be to embrace not just their personal relationship, but her role as a supernatural queen, the responsibilities that came with royal blood, and the dangers that would follow her for the rest of her life. It would mean leaving behind any hope of a normal, quiet existence and stepping into a world of politics and power that could easily destroy someone unprepared for its demands. But as she looked into Kale's eyes, as she felt the mystical connection between them pulling at her soul like gravity, Seraphina realized there was no real choice to be made. This was who she was meant to be, what she'd been born for, the destiny that had been waiting for her to find the courage to claim it. Marcus had stolen years from her, had murdered her family and tried to erase her very identity, but he hadn't succeeded in destroying the fundamental truth of her nature. She was a queen, and it was time to start acting like one. "I accept," she said formally, the words carrying a weight and authority that seemed to resonate through the very fabric of reality. "I claim you as my guardian, my protector, my mate. I bind myself to you as you have bound yourself to me, in the sight of the moon and by the power of the blood that flows through my veins." The words came from somewhere deeper than conscious memory, ancient phrases passed down through generations of royal ceremonies, and as she spoke them, she felt power building between them like a gathering storm. Kale's eyes went wide with an emotion too complex to name, relief and joy and desperate love all tangled together with something that might have been religious awe. "My queen," he said, dropping to one knee again in a gesture that seemed as natural as breathing. "My lady. My heart and soul and sword are yours, now and always, until the moon herself falls from the sky and the world ends in darkness." The formal completion of their bond sent shockwaves through the supernatural community that could be felt for miles in every direction. Every creature with even a trace of mystical awareness turned toward the glass tower where their new queen had finally claimed her birthright, and in that moment, the balance of power that had remained static for 18 years began to shift. Some would rejoice at the news, recognizing the hope for stability and unity that her return represented. Others would begin planning her destruction, determined to maintain the chaos that had allowed them to prosper in her absence. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of Kale's penthouse, Seraphina felt only the overwhelming rightness of finally being exactly who she was meant to be. The broken, frightened girl Marcus had created was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her power and purpose. The real war was just beginning, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready to fight it. Outside the windows, lightning split the sky in patterns that seemed almost like writing, as if the storm itself was announcing the return of the Moonborn dynasty to a world that had forgotten what it meant to have a true queen. The game had changed completely, and every supernatural creature in existence would soon learn that the lost princess had finally come home. Chapter 5: The Omega's Power. The world tilted sideways, and Seraphina gripped the window frame to keep from falling as Kale's words rewrote everything she thought she knew about reality. Lightning flashed again, strobing across his face and revealing features that were both terrifyingly alien and impossibly familiar, like something from dreams she'd forgotten upon waking. Her logical mind rejected what she was seeing, scrambling for rational explanations, hallucinations brought on by stress, tricks of light and shadow, a breakdown finally claiming what was left of her sanity. But her body knew better, responding to some primal recognition that bypassed thought entirely. "That's impossible," she whispered, but even as the words left her lips, memories began surfacing like bubbles rising from deep water. Childhood nights when she dreamed of running through forests on four legs, feeling more at home under moonlight than sunshine. The way animals had always been drawn to her, wild creatures approaching without fear when they should have fled from human contact. The inexplicable sense of wrongness she'd felt her entire adult life, like she was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. People can't just change into animals. That's not real. Kale moved closer, and she could smell that wild scent again, stronger now, mixing with the storm-charged air until she felt dizzy with it. "You felt it, haven't you?" His voice was gentle but relentless, forcing her to confront truths she'd spent years burying. The restlessness. The feeling that you're living someone else's life. The way your dreams are full of forests and moonlight and the scent of pine. Each word hit like a physical blow because they were all true, every single one, and she'd thought she was the only person in the world who experienced such impossible longings. "Show me," she breathed, and Kale's eyes flashed with something that might have been relief or hunger or both. He stepped back into the center of the room, and Seraphina watched in fascination and terror as his human form began to blur at the edges. His bones lengthened and reshaped themselves with sounds like breaking branches, his skin sprouting dark fur that gleamed like oil in the lightning-lit room. Within moments, where a man had stood, a massive wolf now crouched, beautiful and terrible and utterly wild, with golden eyes that held all the intelligence and intensity of the man he'd been. The wolf, Kale, padded toward her on silent paws, and every instinct she possessed should have screamed at her to run, to hide, to do anything but stand perfectly still as a predator approached. Instead, she found herself sinking to her knees and extending her hand toward his massive head, tears streaming down her face as recognition slammed into her like a physical force. "I know you," she whispered, and when his wet nose touched her palm, electricity shot through her entire body. "I've been dreaming about you my whole life." The moment Seraphina's lips brushed against the wolf's forehead, the world exploded into light. Power coursed through her veins like liquid fire, awakening parts of herself she'd never known existed, and she felt Kale's beast form shudder beneath her touch as something fundamental shifted in the fabric of reality itself. The air around them crackled with energy that made her hair stand on end, and she could taste magic on her tongue, wild and ancient and absolutely right in a way that made her previous life feel like a pale shadow of true existence. Kale's transformation back to human form was faster this time, less violent, and when he emerged from the golden light that surrounded them both, his eyes were clearer than she'd ever seen them, as if some burden he'd carried for centuries had finally been lifted. "The curse," he breathed, reaching up to cup her face in hands that trembled with emotion. "Seraphina, you broke it. After 300 years of being trapped between forms, unable to fully become either man or wolf." His voice cracked, and she realized the powerful, dangerous creature she'd come to care for was crying. 300 years? The number spun in her head like a roulette wheel, impossible and yet somehow perfectly logical. It explained the old soul weight in his golden eyes, the way he moved like someone who'd fought 1,000 battles and survived them all. It explained why touching him felt like coming home to a place she'd never been but always belonged. How is that possible? How are any of these things possible? But even as she asked, she could feel her own nature stirring to life, bones aching to reshape themselves, senses sharpening until she could hear heartbeats and smell emotions. "You're an Omega," Kale explained, his thumb brushing away tears she didn't remember crying. "The rarest of our kind, born once in a generation with the power to heal what's broken, to complete what's incomplete. The pack elders said only an Omega's willing kiss could break the curse that bound me, but I'd given up hope decades ago." His forehead pressed against hers, and she could feel his relief and gratitude and something deeper, a love that transcended time and logic and everything she'd thought she understood about the world. Marcus's shouts from the building's lobby, carried to them on supernatural hearing, shattered the golden moment like glass against stone. He'd found her somehow, was demanding the security guards let him up to collect his property, and Seraphina felt her newly awakened wolf spirit snarl with protective rage. But as Kale's eyes blazed with lethal intent and his muscles coiled for violence, a new scent drifted through the window on the storm wind, another predator, older and more dangerous, with eyes like ice and intentions that promised a reckoning neither of them was prepared for. The curse might be broken, but their story was just beginning, and in the darkness beyond the city, something ancient had awakened to the taste of Omega power on the wind.